The New Jim Crow is a book by Michelle Alexander, an acclaimed civil rights lawyer, advocate, and legal scholar. Some transition statements have been added to this video, primarily at the start of each new image, but the vast majority of the narration directly quotes Michelle Alexander's text. Read the full book to learn much more about our current system of injustice. She states, if the movement that emerges to challenge mass incarceration fails to confront squarely the critical role of race in the basic structure of our society, and if it fails to cultivate an ethic of genuine care, compassion, and concern for every human being, the collapse of mass incarceration will not mean the death of racial caste in America. Inevitably, a new system of racialized social control will emerge, one that we cannot foresee. Few find it surprising that Jim Crow arose following the collapse of slavery. What is remarkable is that hardly anyone seems to imagine that similar political dynamics may have produced another caste system in the years following the collapse of Jim Crow, one that exists today. Understanding the history of race in America may require re-educating yourself in some ways, but it will give more context to the beginnings of the war on drugs in the 1970s and 80s. We will begin in September 1986. With the media frenzy at full throttle, the House passed legislation that allocated $2 billion to the anti-drug crusade. Later that month, the Senate proposed even tougher anti-drug legislation, including far more severe punishment for distribution of crack, which was associated with blacks. The dramatic shift toward punitiveness resulted in a massive reallocation of public resources. By 1996, the penal budget was double the amount that had been allocated to the aid to families with dependent children or food stamps. It effectively made the construction of prisons the nation's main housing program for the urban poor. And this reallocation of money away from programs for poor families and toward law enforcement and prisons was centered around the creation of the war on drugs. Drug offenses alone account for 2/3 of the rise in the federal inmate population and more than half of the rise in state prisoners between 1985 and 2000. When the war on drugs gained full steam in the mid-1980s, prison admissions for African Americans skyrocketed, reaching in 2000 a level more than 26 times the level in 1983. The war on drugs disproportionately impacts people of color due to biased police practices such as stop and frisk. And for people who aren't on foot, the Supreme Court ruled that an officer's motivations are irrelevant when evaluating the reasonableness of police activity under the Fourth Amendment, so the police are free to use minor traffic violations as a pretext to conduct drug investigations. And they pull over black motorists at alarming rates. When a motorist does know the right to say no, another legal option for officers is to bring a drug-sniffing dog to the scene. Initially, the announcement of a war on drugs was met with some confusion and resistance within law enforcement. It required a diversion of resources away from more serious crimes such as murder, rape, grand theft, and violent assault, all of which were far greater concern to most communities than illegal drug use. Huge cash grants were made to those law enforcement agencies that were willing to make drug law enforcement a top priority. And state and local law enforcement agencies were granted the authority to keep, for their own use, the vast majority of cash and assets they seized when waging the drug war. The war on drugs was embraced and extreme tactics employed. Michelle Alexander tells us that SWAT teams originated in the 1960s but were used rarely, primarily for extraordinary emergency situations. Today, the most common use of SWAT teams is to serve narcotics warrants. In recent years, dozens of people have been killed by the police in the course of these raids, including those innocent of any crime. A recent and tragic example of this is the murder of Breonna Taylor. Once the financial incentives for waging the war became too attractive to ignore, law enforcement agencies had to ask themselves, if we're going to wage this war, where should it be fought, and who should be taken prisoner? In 1987, the Supreme Court ruled in McCluskey v. Kemp that racial bias in sentencing, even if shown through credible statistical evidence, would be tolerated virtually to any degree so long as no one admitted it. And in 2000, the very same year that Human Rights Watch was reporting that African Americans were being arrested and imprisoned at unprecedented rates, government data revealed that blacks were no more likely to be guilty of drug crimes than whites, and that white youth were actually the most likely of any racial or ethnic group to be guilty of illegal drug possession and sales. Yet, when black youth fail, stumble, and make mistakes, as all humans do, shame and blame is heaped upon them. To make matters worse, when someone enters the criminal justice system, they rarely get out. Probationers and parolees are at increased risk of arrest because their lives are governed by additional rules that do not apply to everyone else. In 1980, only 1% of all prison admissions were parole violators. 20 years later, more than one-third, 35%, of prison admissions resulted from parole violations. To put the matter more starkly, about as many people were returned to prison in 2000 as were admitted to prison in 1980. Michelle Alexander makes strong arguments that the stigma of criminality acts as a tool for legalized discrimination. Failure to maintain gainful employment could mean more prison time, yet nearly every state allows private employers to discriminate on the basis of past criminal convictions. Additionally, 48 states and the District of Columbia prohibit inmates from voting while incarcerated for a felony offense, and the United Nations Human Rights Committee has charged that U.S. disenfranchisement policies are discriminatory and violate international law. We know there is discrimination in our law enforcement and legal systems, yet many people, namely white people, continue to victim blame. Alexander states that the current system invites observers to imagine that those who are trapped in the system were free to avoid second-class status from society simply by choosing not to commit crimes. Urging anyone to live up to their highest ideals and values is a good thing, as it demonstrates confidence in the ability of all people to stretch, grow, and evolve. The intuition underlying moral uplift strategies is fundamentally sound. Our communities will never thrive if we fail to respect ourselves and one another. As a liberation strategy, however, the politics of responsibility is doomed to fail. Instead, we need to confront our own wrongdoings and refuse to look away or to seek the comfort of ignorance. We need deep institutional reform, and the time has always been now. Call your representatives, continue to educate yourself, and talk to others around you. Michelle Alexander offers solutions such as removing financial incentives and military equipment from police departments, ending racial profiling and the drug enforcement only in black and brown neighborhoods, as well as ending legalized discrimination against felons. She advocates for adding more data collection of police and prosecutor enforcement, more funding for public defenders, drug treatment for all, and meaningful reentry programs. The commitment to change has to be collective, and it has to specifically address the racialized violence in our country. We can no longer pretend to be colorblind.